The Epistle to the Hebrews is a very odd one in the New Testament. Widely considered one of the greatest literary works of the New Testament writing, nobody seems to know who wrote it. Now, traditionally, Paul is the author, but the epistle does not name its author. It never says who wrote it. And as early as the 3rd century, people were questioning whether or not it was written by Paul, mainly because its style not only is different than Paul, but it shows a higher understanding and a greater skill in Greek than any other Paul's writings do. Now, there are many proposed authors from as early as AD 50 or mid-50s with Apollos, or possibly Aquila and Priscilla, Linus, who would later become the Bishop of Rome, all the way up to as late as Origen, I believe, in the 2nd century writing it. So people have wondered who has written this. The epistle itself is an attempt to persuade the Jewish Christians to abandon the law of Moses more fully. That's its purpose. Its purpose is to show that we no longer need the law of Moses, that we are under a new covenant. Because up to this point, the Jewish saints, they've kind of excused the Gentiles from following the law of Moses, but they still insist that Jewish saints follow the law of Moses. And they have this idea that because they follow the law of Moses, they are somehow better than the Gentiles. Now, Paul has written about this in almost every epistle he has written. He addressed it to the Colossians, he addressed it to the Galatians, he addressed it to the Corinthians, to the Philippians. He has mentioned it in every letter that he has written, with the exception of Philemon, I think. So this is not a doctrine that is foreign to Paul. The ideas that it teaches are very much what Paul taught. And therefore, we know that it's also what the rest of the apostles taught, because they were a unified people. They were unified in their doctrine. Unlike what many scholars claim, James and Paul were not teaching two different kinds of Christianity. They were all teaching the same gospel under the direction of Peter, who was the president. He was the head of the church at the time. Now, I would say that Paul wrote this because the prophets tell us this. The modern prophets affirm that Paul wrote the epistle to the Hebrews, but the church itself in the Bible dictionary states that it is unclear who wrote it. It still agrees with Paul and his doctrine, but we don't know. We can't be certain who exactly wrote it. As to the timing, as I said, scholars are all over the place as to when it was written, as some as early as 50, 55, some as late as about 200. I think it was written in the same period as the rest of the New Testament. I do not believe it was written much later, because by the time you get into even the 1st century, you are in the apostasy. We see evidence of the apostasy throughout all the Pauline epistles. Paul is trying almost desperately to hold the saints together and keep them from falling away. So it doesn't make any sense that 100 years later, you would still have prophets writing Scripture. The apostasy is already in full swing by then. So I will assume that it was written around the same time as the other writings, which all seem to have been written sometime between about the late 40s, maybe 48, 49, and 70 AD, with the exception of John's writing, which comes after 70. But everything else is in that early period, because that's, by the time of 70 AD, most of the apostles have already been killed. And I do think that this would have been written by an apostle. It would not have been considered scripture if it was not written by an apostle. So I place it here while Paul is in Rome. Whether Paul wrote it, or whether it was another one of the apostles, whether Peter, maybe somebody else had been called as an apostle, such as Barnabas. He is referred to as an apostle in the scriptures. We don't really know exactly. So I'm putting it here. I think it was written from Rome. This is at the beginning of Nero's time as emperor. And the persecution of Christians within Rome itself is slowly escalating. It becomes really bad after the Great Rome Fire of 64. And Nero wants to blame the Christians, and he rounds a lot of them up, and that's when Paul and Peter get arrested. Peter is in Rome at this time with Paul. We don't know who else is here. Luke might be here too. We just don't know. There's a number of people here. Any one of them could have written it, but they're sending it back most likely to Jerusalem, but possibly to the Asia Minor area, but addressing it directly to the Jewish saints and trying to bring them, away out of the law of Moses and into a more unified practice of the Christian covenant. And that's what we have for the Epistle to the Hebrews. So, let us now read it.